Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting this beautiful photograph from Pixabay, but I'm going to first remove that long seawall from the background to simplify it and make it, I think, the composition work and make it a lot easier to tackle as a loose painting. I've just very lightly sketched in the sea walls, the upper and the lower one, where the trees will be, and the position of the rocks and the horizon line. And that's all I need, is just a very simple indication of where things are placed in my composition. I'm using Saunders Waterford cold pressed paper, and from top left I'm using Payne's Grey, indigo and sepia, and then raw and burnt sienna. They are squeezed out freshly from my Cotman tube paints. My board is at an angle of about 45 to 60 degrees. The paper is taped there. As I paint, it will swell a little bit, but then because it's taped, as it dries, it'll dry lovely and flat. First things first, I want a very plain graduated wash across the sky, almost a flat wash, but I want it to be paler across the middle and a bit darker across the top and across the bottom. So I'm just using my large Harkey brush, but you can use any large wash brush for this that you're comfortable with. And I'm just stroking the paint from side to side, horizontally, very lightly, just to even things out a bit. And when I think it looks about right, I will lay it flat and let it dry. It's now dry, and it's dried nice and smooth and even with that light across the middle that I was looking for. I've mixed up on my palette reasonably sort of pale watery mixtures of those colours, and I shall dip into them, starting off with the raw sienna, and use my 3/4 inch flat brush to start painting in the upper and lower sea walls. The idea here is to begin to build up a very loose impression of the texture on the walls and the colours on the walls without putting in too much detail. So I'm going to use a layered approach for this painting, and this first layer is going to consist of dropping in different shades of the colours mentioned before and listed below into the wall with the flat brush, using geometric vertical or horizontal strokes with the tip and the flat, just to build up an underlayer in a fairly pale colour that will work for the walls. I like using flat brushes for man-made structures like walls, houses, buildings, etc. They're very useful to give you nice straight lines where you want them, and then that contrasts nicely against the natural environment in which the walls are found. And I'll continue to work like this, building up shadows near the base of the walls, texture across the walls, using different mixtures of the paint just to get this started. I'm just putting in just the vague beginnings of the beach below the wall, just using very watery mixture just to map it out. And now, while the paint's still wet, I'm taking a stiff bristle brush and I'm flicking, first of all, clean water into the wall area. I'm facing my brush downwards so that I don't get any spatter in the sky. So I'm keeping it very close to the page so I can just limit the spatter to the wall. Now that's a mixture of the darker colours to make some slightly darker marks. Where I put the water on, it's created some very nice textures for this underpainting. I'm going to leave the wall to dry now, and using my small calligraphy brush, which is just a very cheap generic brush that I found on eBay, nothing special. Now I'm going to use it to mix together indigo and raw sienna to make this nice rich dark green. Got a touch of sepia in there just to make it even darker. And I'm going to begin to paint in the trees that are growing behind this upper wall. I'm loosely following the penciled outline that I put in at the beginning, so I know how far I want my tree to extend. And there will be some branches coming in above it, across the top too. I'm just sort of wriggling and scribbling the brush around really with the paint on, and adding water to the brush so that I can then soften certain parts and make the paint paler and weaker in others, so that there is, even from the start, some sort of differentiation in tone and colour across this area. Now I've added more indigo and Payne's grey to the mixture, and I'm adding in some darks and some shadows. I'm still trying to keep a ragged edge to the tree, and I'm still trying to keep just a few sort of lighter areas. Now with the tip of the calligraphy brush, I'm just pulling down a few leaves and strands and branches just overhanging the wall, because I think that looks rather nice, and it helps to integrate the wall and the tree so they don't look too separate. Next I'm going to dot in the foliage for the branches that come across the tape and above the tree from a taller tree just out of frame. I'm not going to paint the branches this time. This is just the foliage. I'll come back when the foliage is dry and then paint in twigs and branches. I'll let the foliage dry for a while and carry on now with the layers of tone on the walls. Using the flat brush again and pulling across a light glaze of just a sort of greyed out raw sienna with the indigo and Payne's grey. Now some darker tones near the base of the top wall. Every time I add these light layers of paint, it dries back a lot lighter, and then you can carry on building up those layers, get a nice weathered effect. That's the idea anyway. And some nice dark Payne's grey across the bottom just to build up the shadow at the bottom of the wall where the wall will meet the beach. Now I've mixed up a very, very rich Payne's grey mixture with a bit of indigo in it. It's tube consistency, just a little bit of water, and I'm pulling across these low, rounded but sort of fairly flat-topped rock shapes. I'm following my guideline that I penciled in roughly, but not exactly, and just filling in the rocks where I think that they would look best. I'm not copying the photograph, I'm just using the photograph as inspiration to try and get the same kind of look in my own way. Now, I'm using this thick paint because I want to use the corner of a plastic card to scrape out some extra detail and texture in a moment. I've washed out my brush and picked up some burnt sienna, tube consistency again, and I'm going to paint in a few rocks here and there in this lovely bright colour to add some variation to the rocky pile, but I still want everything to be really dark and rich here. I'm making sure to keep the brushstrokes flat across the bases where they either meet the beach on the left or the water on the right. Next, take something like an old store card, a plastic flexible card with sort of rounded corner, and cut it so you've got a sharp corner if you need it, and run it through the thick damp paint. And what it does is it scrapes aside the paint, and the paint pulls around the edges of where you've scraped, and you get a paler mark surrounded by a darker mark. And this can create the effect quite nicely of light on the rocks and different tones and textures. Once you've done this scraping, sometimes you need to go back in with the dark Payne's grey or your dark colour, whatever you're using, and just touch in and around the light areas that you've created, just to further enhance the shape and the form of the rocks. There's a 4-part full tutorial over on Patreon for this painting that shows just about every brush stroke and goes into a lot more detail about the techniques and tips as to how to achieve certain effects, ways of simplification. It includes the drawing at the beginning and lots more details. The link for Patreon is in the description below if you'd like to take a look. When I'm happy with my rocks, then I'll go back in with some dark Payne's grey, maybe a bit of sepia in it, and indigo, but mostly Payne's grey, and just add in some more dark shadows just to differentiate the wall from the beach, and to add a bit more shadow, more layering of these shadows. And now I'm just going to let the whole thing dry naturally. It's all nice and dry now. So the next thing that I want to do is lift out a little bit of light in the water. I'm going to do this with a clean damp flat brush and draw it across the water, just the tips, horizontally a few times, and this will just start working on the paint, and then I can use a tissue and wipe through in the same direction as the lines that I have made to create just faint white marks of sunlight or ripple on the water, just a hint. Now I'll move across to the other side, and with a mixture of raw and burnt sienna and sepia later, I'll use the tips of the flat brush and horizontal sweeping motions to just begin to put in the first layers for the reflection of the wall. I'm going to build up quite a few layers on this reflection. The first ones, as I say, will be horizontal sweeps of the brush for both walls. I'm trying to make sure that I don't extend these reflections out any further than the actual walls themselves, and then just bring the lines downwards. These horizontal brush strokes will give us the look of sort of ripples and a slight amount of movement on the water. I'm now putting in some darks with the Payne's grey between the lighter reflection marks. And now that I like that first layer, I'm going to put some weaker paint, but I'm going to dab the water off so it's not too watery, and I'm going to pull down through those horizontal lines that I've made with wide vertical brush strokes coming down over the tape where the wall is at its highest, and just coming down halfway through the water for the rest of the wall. This might look a little bit heavy-handed, but it should work. I can still see some of my horizontal brush strokes, but they're sort of slightly obscured by these vertical ones, but that's fine because I'm just going to work backwards and forwards, horizontal and vertical, just to build up the texture in the water, the shadows and the light. There are many approaches to doing reflections, and this is just one way. I think it works fairly well in this instance, although it's a loose painting, it's quite detailed. I'm just pulling out some light with a tissue, just very lightly stroking the tissue across the painting in places. And now back in with the flat brush, just sweeping it very gently with the tips to add a bit more shadow under the rocks, just right where the rocks meet the water. Now I'm going back into this very pale grey mixture that I had before, and I'm going to just very slightly darken up the sea up to the horizon line that I penciled in. I'm using my flat brush, this mixture of very, very pale grey, which is almost like paint water. It's very, very weak, because I just think I want a tiny bit of, as I said, differentiation between the sea and the sky. I'd like the sea to be slightly darker than the sky at the horizon. Just feathering the paint across. We'll see how it dries. The flat brush is a good tool for this, because if you're careful, if you sort of lock your arm as well as you draw it slowly across the page, you can achieve some really nice straight lines. Just blending it into the rest of the water very gently. Now I'm going to carry on with the reflections. I think they still need a little bit of work. They're nearly there. It's just alternating again with the flat brush between using the tips for horizontal sweeps of either colour or lifting out, and then vertical strokes. And even though I've gone over these areas quite a lot, each time it's sort of built another layer up, a very light layer. And with watercolour being transparent, I'm getting quite a lot of nice reflections starting to come through with this gradual layering. Now that slightly darkened sea area is beginning to dry, a little bit patchy, so I'm just going to smooth the flat brush gently across it. It's damp, but mostly dry, just very slightly damp. And as I say, I'm just using the tips very lightly and blending that, and that smoothed it out a bit better. I've just decided to add some more rocks. I want a big rock coming across the base of that wall in front of it now, and so I'm just adding a few more rocks just to fill out that area just a little bit more. Just the odd dots and dashes of dark here and there, just starting to really bring the painting alive now. I've changed to my number 3, I think, Daler Rowney Graduate Rigger brush, and a nice rich Payne's grey with a bit of sepia in it to just pull through some branches and twigs, etc., through the foliage that I painted a while ago. This added detail of dark paint for the trunks and the twigs just here brings a bit more sort of form and three-dimensionality to this area. I think it makes the tree look as if it really is growing from behind the seawall and leaning over. Gives it a more finished look, I think. And a finishing touch just to add some little dots and dashes of foliage that look as if they're just little loose leaves at the end of some of the longer branches, just reaching out over that wall. And I think this small detail just helps to adds a bit more to this area, because it really adds some light. We see light coming through the branches just there. Now that the rocks and the trees are just about finished, I'm just going to strengthen up the wall, the tones in the wall, with some stronger raw sienna, and using a glaze that I'm pulling unevenly in horizontal brush strokes here and there, and vertical brush strokes as well. It will dry back a little bit lighter than this, but it will just give me that finish, I think, to the wall. The textures that I've already painted will show through, because all these colours are transparent colours and the layers have been very thin. But I think that just gives it a little bit more of that kind of weathered stone look. Time for some finishing touches. The details now. These lampposts, I'm putting them in carefully with the edges, the tips of my flat brush, You can pencil these in if you like first, it makes life a lot easier. I always check the tips of my flat brush and my paint in my palette and make sure that it's making a really nice thin mark on the palette before I then paint on the paper. This is my small calligraphy brush, and I'm going to draw some little cup-shaped lamps on top of the lampposts. Just keeping these details nice and simple. It's nothing more than a sort of stick with a little cup on the top. And now I'm going to use my artistic license to add some railings. They're not in the original photograph, but I think that they will look nice here. And I think I've said this before in demos recently, that you get to a point where the painting takes on a life of its own and you no longer look at the photograph that you're using. You have to look at the painting as its own unique thing and then do what that painting needs. Taking a smaller rigger, just going to roughly hit and miss the paper, leaving some little gaps there, joining up the railings with sort of like chains. And I think that looks quite effective there. I'm touching the tips of the flat brush along the edge of the sea wall there, just to put a little bit more shadow across the edge, just below the railings. And then I'll just add a few more darks right under the rocks, very thin marks, just here and there, just where I think it needs it. I think that will do. Just flattening out underneath those rocks that are sticking out of the sea towards the right. I'll now use my fine rigger and paint in a few seagulls, trying to keep them fairly small. Just be nice to add a sign of life. You could add figures to this. It would be quite nice to have figures standing, looking out to sea next to the lamppost. But I think I'm going to go with birds for my signs of life. It's time now to add some white highlights. That's white gouache that I've mixed up separately in a small pot lid. And I'm going to put some white highlights inside the lamps. I'm going to pick out the chains or ropes and little details of the fence. So now that stands out quite nicely. It's a more sort of finished look to it, if you know what I mean. I think I'll put some white across the gulls' backs of their wings. I think I had too much on my brush there. That's gone on. It's a bit heavy-handed, so I'll just dab that off. It's better. I've wiped off some of the paint from my brush and just a quick flick and that's better. It looks like the light is catching the gulls now. Now I need to just check that I've got a good vertical line of sight down from my lampposts, and I'm going to put reflections of the lamppost light in the water. And a last touch of shadow to balance things up on the wall using the flat brush, keeping it nice and soft and fairly uneven, but I think that's a lot better now. So I think that's just about finished. I'm looking at it now and I'm not sure. I think I might have to add another lamppost towards the left, because I've extended the wall a little bit in mine using my artistic license. So now there seems to be quite a wide gap. Yeah, so I think I'm going to have one more lamppost. Something's been niggling me about the composition and proportions. And I think that's what it is. Sometimes you can't see what a painting needs until you step away from it and then come back and look at it freshly. So I'm just going to put in this third lamppost, making sure it's the same height as the others. Now that dot of gouache, which stands out beautifully from the dark trees. And that's much better. I think that's given me the proportions that I need now for the composition. So now all I need to do is to reflect that third lamppost in the water with a little bit of white gouache. And then strengthen up the other two lamp reflections because they've dried back a bit. Gouache does that. You sometimes have to go over a couple of times. And then I'm going to put in the reflections of the lampposts using just a sort of wiggly dot and dash line, keeping it nice and vertical. And I'll do the same for the fence posts. And I think I'm going to call it a day after that. Now, it took a bit longer than I expected it to, but it's come together reasonably well. Thanks so much for watching. And thank you so much to my lovely patrons in my Patreon group, more than 300 now, which is fantastic. They support this channel and I'm very grateful for that. I'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye and happy painting.